All right, folks. My name's Dave Waddington. I'm the co-director of the Center for the Study of Learning and Performance, which is where you find yourself today. I'll start us off today with a quick land acknowledgement. Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Ginenkia'aka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal is known historically as a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. So welcome to the first talk in our 2025-2026 CSLP speaker series. We're delighted to be hosting Lauren Bialystok, and I'll say more about her in a second. But first, let me just say a little bit about the CSLP. Center for the Study of Learning and Performance. We are an interinstitutional research center funded by the Fonds de Recherche du Québec, and we specialize in a number of different educational research areas. If you would like to know more about what our research center does, I'd invite you to visit our website and to follow us on LinkedIn or on Facebook, where you will receive announcements for more events like this one. So the way that our event today will work is that Lauren will talk to us for 50 minutes or so, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end, probably till about 5:30. And just like at Quebec Town Council meetings, anyone who asks a question will be limited to 2 minutes maximum, okay? And if folks would like to pose questions in French, they're welcome to do so either orally here in the chat, and I will do my best to translate. So now that all the preliminaries, well, not all the preliminaries, one left, okay, are over, let me introduce Lauren. So, Lauren Bialystok is Associate Professor in the Department of Social Justice Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, also known as OISE, and a member of the Advisory Board to the Center for Ethics. Her research spans topics in ethics, education, and identity. She has published on authenticity, social justice education, open-mindedness, sex education, and high school philosophy. She is the co-author with Lisa Anderson of Touchy Subject, The History and Philosophy of Sex Education, published by University of Chicago Press, and co-editor with Bruce Maxwell of the Educational Foundation series published by Bloomsbury. Her current project is investigating the impact of AI on assessment in the humanities, which is why we are welcoming her here today. Take it away, Lauren.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? And Stephen, am I good back there as well? All right. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for joining us in person and online. I have to extend my thanks to my friend Dave Waddington, it's great if Dave Waddington is a fan of yours because he has a lot of speaking opportunities. And it's always a pleasure to come and speak at Concordia and see my friends, including McGill and U2M, and to see all your lovely faces. So I'm really happy to be here. And as Dave said, I've been working on the ethical and pedagogical implications of AI in education. What I've got here for you today is a new talk, and it's building on some themes that I've been developing over the last few years, but I'm looking forward to your thoughts and feedback. I'll probably be making some very broad generalizations, but I want to see how well this reasoning holds up. And I hope you find it, at the very least, thought-provoking and maybe even entertaining. And the title of my talk, which may be literally true or may just be catchy, I don't know, is Transparency is the New Originality. So first, I have to figure out how to get my slides to switch. That's the first thing. All right. So for those of you at Concordia, you may have actually seen this statement before or been to this webpage. This is your own institutional learner generative AI, Gen AI for short, transparency statement requirement. And this is not exclusive to Concordia. In fact, since generative AI has been with us, which you may recall is almost 3 years now, most institutions have responded by providing a requirement and sometimes a template for disclosing students' use of AI in work that they submit for assessment. And this is called transparency. Transparency is a lovely value. Transparency seems to be associated with truthfulness and honesty and integrity and things we value. It just didn't really seem required until a few years ago when suddenly there was AI available. So this is the Concordia one, but the studies that are reviewing institutional responses to AI show that universities around the world are basically adopting this kind of policy. And what that means is if you're a student and you're submitting something, you may need to declare yourself by filling out a form more or less like this. Say which AI tool or tools you used and which version, because there's many versions now, and fill in the boxes as you can see here. So some of you may have even done this as students or as instructors, required your students to do this. And as I said, it's become kind of common practice. I have to push really hard on the ThinkerPad to get the slide to change. Okay, so in my talk today, I'm going to be addressing three broad questions, and the talk is divided into sections, but they get shorter and shorter as we go along, so don't panic if we're at the end of the first session and it's really late. The first question is, what problem is transparency, as I've just shown you, trying to fix? The second is originality over? And the third is, why don't we just change academic expectations? So I'm going to be walking you through, in some cases, like fairly basic reasoning, trying to tease apart the ethics of assessment in general, and in some cases, fairly, abstract, or give you examples of recent studies and things that are going on to try to provoke thinking about how the ethics of assessment should inform our response to this particular problem. Really hard. Okay, there we go. So section one. What problem is transparency trying to fix? As I said, transparency sounds like a good thing. It's a virtue, all else equal. So it's not that we wouldn't want students to be transparent, but this is a new thing. Why do we suddenly have transparency statements? Okay, I'm going to take you back to around December 2022. These are just a few of the countless memes that I found circulating on the internet around that time. And they speak for themselves. As soon as ChatGPT, the first version, was released, I doubt I need to remind folks in this room, but just to be, well, transparent, that was not planned. Our work as instructors, whether elementary school, secondary school, higher education, whatever level, just changed overnight, right? And students quickly understood that they could use this amazing new tool, if they so wanted, to cheat up to and including writing entire new essays from scratch, right? And unlike other forms of cheating that they had available before, they couldn't be detected the same way. So there's a huge panic about AI cheating. And at that point, I think the contours of the notion of cheating were still very rough. They hadn't been updated to accommodate these new criteria yet. It was just an immediate panic because things that used to be absolutely commonplace, reliable assessment in many different subjects across all levels of education, poof, were not reliable anymore. So that was 2022. Bear with me. There we go. Here's a study from 2024. Okay, so the data is actually probably back to 2023. CopyLeaks is a pioneering force in AI-based text analysis and plagiarism detection. So I don't know their exact methods, but they are in the business of trying to detect how AI is used and how much text from AI is directly copied into other purposes. And they announced new data showing that there was a 76% spike from the previous year in AI generated content among students. And that was in 2024. And in 2025, the New York Magazine published this deliberately shocking article titled, "Everyone is Cheating Their Way Through College." And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's obviously a journalist's take rather than a scientific study of how students are using AI, but I do find that sometimes journalists are doing they're at the forefront of the research because they don't need to wait as long to publish their results as scholars do. So sometimes the best way to find out what's going on campuses is to have really strong journalists who specialize in educational issues. And what they're seeing is that everything has been upended and professors can't keep up. Students are anywhere from flat out cheating and knowing it to confused out of their minds and can't figure out where the lines are and don't know how to position themselves relative to other students when they hear about other people's uses of AI. So it has made higher education a completely different game than it was just a few years ago. Now, what I want to propose here as my first sort of philosophical gambit is that when we talk about cheating and academic integrity as opposite sides of what we expect from students, the criterion that we're using for academic integrity is originality. And you can see this by recalling this extremely old-fashioned form of plagiarism detection, Turnitin or one of those things. Turnitin would, highlight the text and show you what website it was taken from. And what's understood there is that copying and pasting without attribution is unoriginal, and that's what makes it cheating. And we have long used originality as a loose proxy for everything we're looking for in academic integrity among students, and more generally as the minimum requirement for academic work. I'm going to talk about scholarship as well a little bit later. So originality is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. And as we just saw, ChatGPT makes it very easy to create text that is original in the sense of novel. It can't be traced to a pre-existing website, but not original in the sense of it came from the work of the student who was supposed to submit it. So we have a problem. Originality isn't serving the purpose that it was supposed to serve. No, I haven't seen this written down anywhere, but when I tried to recreate the reasoning of those administrators and educators behind the transparency statement that I showed you earlier, this requirement of disclosing one's use of AI, what I assumed is that they're thinking something like this. First, not citing your sources is cheating. Okay, we all agree on that. Long-standing criterion of originality. Students are now using a new source. It's different from SparkNotes or Wikipedia, but it's a new source, and if they're not citing it, it's kind of similar to other sources that we would ding them for not citing. And so the conclusion is they have to cite it or else it's cheating. Now, how do you cite generative AI? There are actually new inclusions in the style guides. If you want to go look at Chicago and MLA and stuff now, you can find out how to cite ChatGPT and its ilk. However, it's easier for the instructor to see what's going on if the student cites their use of generative AI with the kind of form that I showed you and actually spells out maybe what prompts they used and how they adapted what the AI spit out. So this is, like I said, not something I've seen. I can't attribute it to anyone, but it seems pretty rational. And I would say it's a sound syllogism. But as I'm going to try to argue, it misdiagnoses the problem. Let's check each of the premises to make sure it's valid before we decide if it's sound. The students are using a new source. Hi. When we say that the new source, generative AI, is akin to cheating, we need to actually take a step back and figure out what we mean by cheating itself, because that was already assumed. Like I said, you copy a sentence out of a journal article and you don't cite it, that's cheating. But why is that wrong? What is originality supposed to be tracking there that is morally problematic? So here's what I'm going to propose we use. First of all, cheating is not fair to other students. Okay, it violates a basic fairness norm. And the way that it's not fair to other students is that it distorts the economy of assessment. So if an A means a certain thing in a certain class, and all of the honest students are ranked according to their work so that the distribution falls a certain way, and then they take that grade out of the class and are judged accordingly, the student who gets an A by cheating, by not citing their sources and stuff like that, is compromising the integrity of the whole system. It means that now the other student who has a B looks worse off even if they did more or better work by themselves than the student who cheated in order to get an A. And of course, it means that a student who got an A honestly looks like they're just as good as the student who got an A by cheating. So if a student gets away with cheating, there is a real unfairness consequence to other students. I also think it's unfair to the teacher and to other people, but I won't dwell on that right now. The second thing that I would say is wrong with cheating is it frustrates the aims of education. Okay, if you're submitting an assignment, you're in a class, you're in some kind of formal educational environment, the idea is to learn, and cheaters don't learn what they're supposed to. And you can see with the hand there, that's all stuff that the person whose hand it is was supposed to know, and they're reading it off their hand instead. So this may seem incredibly obvious, but I wanted to take the time to spell it out because this is old school thinking about plagiarism and cheating. Let's see if it's addressing the new kind of world we're in. Um, Let me just say before I go to the next slide. So the question I'm going to ask is, does transparency, as I've described it, do what we need it to do to address this conception of what's wrong with cheating? There is another question too, though, which is, can we even enforce transparency? Okay. And studies are preliminary, but maybe it won't surprise you to know that one big study found that 74% of students failed to declare AI usage despite declaration being a requirement. So it's one thing to ask, will transparency accomplish what we want it to, ethically, pedagogically, assuming students comply with it? As it turns out, there isn't even good reason right now to assume that students will comply with it. Why is that? In this study, sit down here, they found that some students have this expectation of privacy because of perhaps the way that they grew up with different digital opportunities. And to quote one student, I see AI as just another tool, like a calculator. Why should I have to tell anyone that I used it? Another student stated, it feels invasive to have to declare every little tool I use. It's my work, and I should be able to use whatever helps me. Another reason is that this seems to be a sort of classical collective action problem. Like, if I know that everyone else in my class isn't declaring their use of AI, I'm going to suffer if I'm the only loser who abides by the policy. So, as one student bluntly stated, everyone is using it. A sentiment echoed in 13 of the 17 interviews. There were way more than 17 participants in the study, by the way. They just interviewed 17 of them, illustrating the strong expectation for AI use in academic context. So this is also part of the problem that we're up against if we're trying to make the use of AI transparent. Oops, sorry. So now we can ask, does transparency help with AI cheating? Using the two aspects of cheating that I referred to earlier. First of all, we know that in this old-fashioned case, it's not fair to other students. Even with transparency, it doesn't seem like AI use is fair to other students because of what I just said. The transparency can't be enforced, and it puts students in almost like a prisoner's dilemma situation where they have to decide whether to abide by a policy knowing that other students aren't. So it's still not fair to other students, even if we have transparency requirements. And it's clear that students can still outsource some of the things that they're supposed to learn. So transparency alone is not ensuring that students are learning the things that we may want them to learn. In that respect, I took this out of the other article, but notice that it's exactly the same setup with the hand here. It's just a robotic hand. I don't think there is functionally much difference between the robotic cheating like this and the old-fashioned writing notes on your hand. Because in both cases, the two things that I said are wrong with cheating are still wrong and can't be avoided through transparency statements. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears a bit and say, what about transparency in publishing? This is where I'm casting my net really wide. So not only do we see disclosure statements being required in work submitted by students for assessment, but we're increasingly seeing it in the world of academic publishing. And I want to assume that there's both continuity and discontinuity between the students and the scholars who are subject to transparency requirements. And I want to look at here what other kind of work is transparency supposed to be doing. So there's a whole array of journals. Maybe some of you have already experienced this. If you're scholars, you go to submit something to a journal now, and you may be also required to check a bunch of boxes or fill out a statement or something like what I showed at the beginning, where you write down whether and how you used generative AI. Here are a couple examples that you might find before submitting your manuscript, and I think these are really interesting. um, Here's Elsevier's new policy. I just bolded some of the words that I thought really spoke to this aim of rooting out unethical work through their new policy. Authors should disclose the use of AI tools in a separate AI declaration statement. They should document their use of AI, the name of the tool used, the purpose. So similar to what I showed you. And they say declaring the use of AI tools supports transparency and trust between authors, readers, reviewers, editors, and contributors, and facilitates compliance with the terms of use of the relevant AI tool, which I guess you find on a separate website. So it's a little bit circular, but they're saying you can use AI in some particular ways that we've written down over there. But what's important is that you declare it, right? Here's another one. This is Sage. And if someone can explain this to me, I'd be quite grateful. On the one hand, Sage says, you are not required to disclose the use of assistive AI tools in your submission, blah, blah, blah. But you are required to inform us of any AI generated content appearing in your work. And it doesn't say whether it's good or bad, legal or illicit, but it says that this will allow the editorial team to make an informed publishing decision regarding your submission, which I mean could mean maybe you lose 2 points if you use AI or something, but they don't spell it out. I picked this one in part to highlight how hard it is to make it work. Do you want to jump in here?
I got the image because I was working with Springer on a textbook and we asked about AI generated images. And they said we couldn't use them because they can't, like the copyright. So especially with the images,
Okay.
They were particular about that. So the image one kind of maybe could be related to copyright. But
It could
anyway,
be. It could
yeah.
be. Thank you for that. But I'm actually going to show you a kind of appalling example of an AI image being used in scholarship momentarily. So I don't know if anybody's really abiding by that either. At any rate, without sounding too patronizing or didactic, because this isn't teachers, this is publishers speaking to grown-up scholars, the publishers are now also effectively requiring a transparency statement, a disclosure of whether AI has been used. Now, I appreciate the effort, but to be clear, originality still matters in scholarship, and we can see that because of some of the ways that AI is indeed being used in scholarship. By originality here, I mean that the research is not being faked, that it comes from the researcher it says it's coming from, not because this is not a brand new problem, okay? So not to deny the fact that we've always had issues of, invented data or something like that, which is inauthentic and unoriginal and bad research and shouldn't be accepted. The question is, how is AI changing or accelerating that? Retraction Watch is one place to start. This is a group that counts up and tracks all of the retractions in academic journals and publishing to track changes and point out when people should not rely on certain research anymore. And according to a recent post, science publishing is a hot mess. AI microscopy, as one example, is indistinguishable from real. And they're always tracking these things. So the number of articles retracted from scientific journals, including big real journals like Nature, okay, not just fly-by-night journals, has skyrocketed in the last few years. There were retractions on account of fake research before, but it's a very different ballgame now. And part of what's happening is that it's a feedback loop because the AI models are being trained on bogus research. Remember, AI models are trained on just what's on the internet already. And the data set, in the case of academic publishing, may still include retracted papers that are available. So AI is not even processing the most up-to-date research. And then here comes the fun image. Some things get published with AI images that are good for a laugh. This is the famous mouse with the very extended member that was generated by AI and somehow, got included in a scientific paper. This is how AI thought to maybe illustrate the reproductive system of mice. So beware AI images, indeed. Even more alarmingly, there are scientific research papers that are taken seriously and sometimes will inspire years of careful research by other scientists trying to build on or replicate the effects, sometimes to do life-saving medical research. And if the original research is bogus, this is obviously not only a colossally inefficient use of everyone's time and money, but it's not advancing medicine. People are dying when they could be being helped more. So this piece, I'm sure you're all familiar with the conversation that came out recently, is about all kinds of bogus scientific research. Again, this problem did exist before, but given what I showed you on the previous slide, imagine how much worse it is with AI-generated research and the growth of fly-by-night journals and paper mills that are using AI to get accepted to academic journals without going through proper vetting. So, I mean, you may be asking, okay, this is a bad situation. We don't want bogus research, especially when it has to do with medicine and science. But doesn't transparency help? Isn't it better to still ask authors if they used AI? I'm not going to say that it's a bad idea to ask authors if they used AI, but I think, as I said earlier, that misdiagnoses the problem. Because in the examples that I just showed you, the problem is not the failure to declare that AI is being used, which is all that a transparency statement can do. It's just a declaration. In the studies that I just showed you, the problem is using AI instead of doing proper research or instead of using very careful human-controlled measures to scrutinize the outcomes of the research. So transparency is not solving the actual problem here. And that brings us back to what I've called the transparency syllogism. As I said, I can't attribute it to anyone. It's just sort of the reasoning that I think is happening. Looks like a sound syllogism. As we've checked, these things are happening. But here's the problem. The reason that we had this expectation in the first place for citing sources was not because everything is fine as long as it's cited. The reason that we had for requiring that everybody cite their sources is because the submitted work is supposed to be original. It is supposed to be processed by the thinker or researcher, student who is putting it together. And that means that the cited sources have to feed into a proper scholarly conversation between humans. We've seen that using AI erodes the originality of the written work or the scholarship. And so at best, what a transparency statement can do is track this erosion. And I think if the erosion is happening, it's good to track it. So I'm not saying transparency is useless, but it's not addressing the problem. It is not dealing with the fact that some work is still being faked or amplified by a non-human source and getting credit as an original piece of work. So I'm going to look more carefully in the next section at originality. Maybe originality is also a thing of the past. So here's section 2. Is originality over? Some of what I've been saying so far may make sense to the more enthusiastic adopters of generative AI in education and scholarship. but at the same time, they may be not very concerned about it. Why? Some people aren't very concerned about it because they think the actual values that we're desperately trying to preserve by establishing these workarounds like transparency statements in the age of generative AI are no longer the right values to be espousing in academic work. And maybe that whole originality obsession we used to have is something that we should get over. So I'm going to give you a few examples of where I see this kind of reasoning and discuss what I think is problematic about it. So here's a guy he's a scientist who runs a blog. The blog is called Scientist Sees Squirrel. And he has a post called, "Aren't AI declarations kind of silly?" So you can imagine me sitting at home doing research for this talk, and I'm Googling things that have been written about AI declarations. And I think, oh, yeah, they are kind of silly. Yeah, I think I want to read this post. Okay, here's why this guy thinks that AI declarations are kind of silly. I honestly don't understand why editors or reviewers should care whether I use ChatGPT in writing my paper. What the peer review system should assess is my manuscript good? Does it make interesting claims, well supported by data, logic, and literature, and clearly communicated? And he goes on, if my manuscript is good, it should be accepted no matter what tools I use to write it. If my manuscript is bad, it should be rejected no matter what tools I use to write it. Now, I think I'm not a scientist, so I want to acknowledge here that there are disciplinary differences in how we use AI and how much of a difference that makes. And when he says writing, like if I use ChatGPT to write my paper, maybe he really just means choosing the best words to convey the data that he himself found using proper scientific methods. So I'm not suggesting that this person is one of the fake researchers, putting out images of mouse reproductive systems and things like that that came from DALI or God knows where. Nonetheless, I find something very disturbing about this reasoning. And I think the concern here is that he's taking good and bad as kind of free floating adjectives here and not asking what it means for humans to assess whether a piece of scholarship is good or bad. So what standards should the editors and reviewers use if they don't care where the writing came from? Can we really assess written papers in this totally free-floating manner? And maybe more concerningly, over time, as more and more is written by AI, do we still have human standards for assessing whether the AI is doing what we as humans would want it to do, or are we now being trained ourselves on AI written or hybrid written material, which I think is actually what's happening in education, and which is why it's going to be very difficult for students in the future to tell the difference. So that's one problem I have. The other question is, if it doesn't matter who wrote it or what he used to write it, should he still get the byline on the article? And should that still be a line on his CV? Because he's not apparently problematizing any of that. He's kind of saying, oh, the writing doesn't matter. But we do, when we see the name underneath an article, assume that that person both did the research and wrote the article. So what's he proposing to address that? Here's another image. This is from actually a teacher website. Matt Miller's the guy, it's called Ditch That Textbook. And this is already from a couple of years ago. And I think this is a very thought-provoking rubric here. So he's given us 6 different layers of AI use this is for student submitted assessment. I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between scholars and students for the rest of the talk here. And he says, at one end, it's entirely student created, and another end, it's entirely bot created. And one of the benefits of this kind of diagram is that it shows plagiarism is probably not just a really bright line, where it's student like bot on one side, student on the other side, but depending on how the students use it, what the assignment is, and so on, there are gradations. And that's why he's saying it's time to rethink plagiarism and cheating. I agree. I think it's time to rethink plagiarism, cheating, not get rid of them. And some of the questions on the left here are good prompts for that. Which of these would you consider cheating? just to be clear, in the old days, everything north of the bottom layer was cheating. Okay, so we're already compromising. We're already saying maybe that's not cheating, but that used to be the expectation that the student wrote the whole assignment without consulting AI. I don't know about the internet, I guess. I'm going to bracket internet because it depends how you're using the internet. Which of these is relevant to our students' future, and which of these would you use in your work as an adult? I think are also interesting questions, and they are coming up a lot more now. Like, what is education for? You know, maybe students don't need to learn all the things they used to learn. And that's not necessarily as radical as it sounds, because students used to learn all sorts of things in school that they don't learn anymore because the world has changed. AI has changed the world, stands to reason that we should rethink what we're teaching students. I think that's fair, and it's way too blunt, because even when this was the requirement, say for an essay assignment, it's not necessarily the case that the student was going to do all of these things in their future, or that it was going to be a job expectation. Specifically with essays, we didn't make students write, you know, a 5-page argumentative essay because we thought that they were all going to get a job where on a weekly basis they had to write a 5-page argumentative essay. That's not what the essay is for, right? It's to build certain kinds of skills: critical thinking, close reading, argumentation, reason. I don't think I need to tell you. And so if we strip away some of those and say, oh, you can outsource that part, or you can outsource that part, they are losing things that we thought were of educational value, not because they were directly applicable to the student's future. Maybe they're still not educationally valuable. I mean, I think they are, but that's a different argument. My point is just, this was never the only rationale for having students do those things. So we are at risk, I think, of turning the whole discourse about educational aims into a very narrow instrumental discourse where people are just asking, will they need to know it, or is AI just going to be doing all of that in the future? Oh, AI is going to do all of that in the future, they don't need to know it. I think that's the wrong way to go about education. This diagram is sort of similar to the last one, but it's converted into rules that an instructor could use, like sort of gradations of AI involvement that an instructor could use in their assignments. And you can see, I know the font is pretty small, but the bold line at the bottom of each one sort of summarizes how much the students can use. Again, I think that this is helpful to show that it's not all or nothing, and that we do have to adjust to the new technology. But it's also taking for granted that we shouldn't be teaching students to do all of these things themselves. And like with the previous slide, I think that sets us on a very dangerous road. Another thing I'll say about this, and recalling my earlier slide with the 76% not declaring their use of AI, how do you enforce this? Like, it's a really nice idea, and I do think we need to have these conversations about the pros and cons of different levels. But let's say, you know, you're at 2. Okay, you're an instructor, and you say, okay, kids, like for this assignment, you're at a 2. You may use AI for planning, idea development, and research. Your final submission should show how you have developed and refined these ideas. How are you going to enforce that? Are you going to stand over them and watch every second when they're doing the assignment? Not to mention, how do you define idea development and research and then draw a line before you transition into developing and refining those ideas? I think it's hopeful, but a little naive. Okay, this one's a doozy. This is from colleague Sarah Elaine Eaton at Brock University, who's become quite famous in the last while, because before ChatGPT was released, she was already working on this notion of post-plagiarism. I'm not going to read all of it, but suffice to say, post-plagiarism is perhaps mixing together a few of the very realistic judgments about how AI is changing the landscape of especially teaching writing, as well as some pretty far-fetched or default attitudes that I think we need to question. So she says that hybrid human AI writing will become normal, and presumably that means we just can't try to prevent it, and students should actually learn how to do it when they're young instead of trying to do all the writing themselves. But she then kind of asserts, like, human creativity is enhanced, and maybe it is in some cases, but I can also think of a lot of ways in which it's compromised or eviscerated entirely. So I don't know like how that premise fits in. Language barriers is an interesting thing that I'm going to leave aside for the purposes of this talk, but I think there's also conversations to be had about translation. And then she asserts, again, seemingly realistically, that humans can relinquish control but not responsibility. But again, I ask, how is that going to work if hybrid human AI writing is the norm? And as I showed you on the previous slide, there's all these levels, but you can't effectively enforce any level that you want your students to stay at. It says attribution remains important, which I take to mean that she would also endorse transparency statements, because citing, referencing, and attribution remain important skills, although I'm not really sure why, if AI writing becomes the norm and we won't necessarily be able to isolate the author, human or non-human, of any given text anymore. I'm not necessarily sure why that's so important. I agree that historical definitions of plagiarism no longer apply, but she's purporting that they will be transcended, and that sounds almost mystical to me, like it's a natural event, like we're going to transcend them. And what and then I guess we arrive at post-plagiarism, which means like there's no such thing as plagiarism anymore. And then how are we going to assess students? So in all of these cases, I do sympathize with a lot of the if not the excitement about generative AI, I do sympathize with the idea that we have to get on board, okay? We can't pretend it's not happening, and we have to start making discriminations between different uses rather than treating all uses as the same. What I don't accept is that we're going to enter a magical age of post-plagiarism where we will be able to meaningfully assess students and evaluate scholarly work without recourse to any standard of plagiarism or originality that we can all agree on. Now, there's something interesting here about how these AI enthusiasts, shall we say, possibly resemble a kind of postmodern literary criticism attitude to authorship. And in that respect, I also have to give them a bit of credit. These are two books from the 1960s, when like avant-garde literary criticism was, at least in France, really at its finest. This is a 1967 text by Roland Barthes, Death of the Author, and this is Michel Foucault, who has an essay, What is an Author, from 1969. And they're really, in true 20th century theory fashion, problematizing this this dualistic kind of mind body, liberal individual person agency autonomy paradigm that gives us authorship as we know it. There's something interesting there. Maybe we're in a moment now where we also have to be beyond authorship, or the author is dead. There's a big difference, though, between what these mid-20th century theorists are saying and what anybody who's completely sanguine about letting generative AI do the writing today is saying, which is that both Barthes and Foucault assume that writing is still a human activity. We may not want the author to have complete control over the meaning of the work. This is Barthes' point, that interpretation is out of the author's control. It's an aesthetic point. And Foucault is also, breaking apart all the ways that authorship has mattered more and less, over Western civilization, as Foucault's want to do. But what they are not questioning is that writing and its interpretation and the reading of a written text is humans interacting with and interpreting humans and interacting with and interpreting humans. And that if need be, you can trace a text back to a human or more than one human. You can. It didn't come from out of nowhere. So I think this is a kind of ironic marriage between some postmodern thinking and some contemporary AI hype, but they're not actually saying the same thing. In fact, what I want to say is that, as maybe benign and old-fashioned as it may sound, what I started with about originality and transparency not replacing it remains the case. Authorship entails human originality, if not exclusively, at least enough to be able to trace the text that's produced to a stick figure who used their brain to write the book. Now, there can be other influences, as Foucault and Barthes said, there are always other influences. But this is where the buck stops. This is what we mean by authorship. So I would say an author is a human who thinks and writes. And we don't have to be committed to a kind of Cartesian view of the self to abide by this overall picture. And I would further say that for academic writing in particular, and think back to those scientific and medical studies where people's lives are at stake, we need academic writing to be accountable to human thought. We need to be able to make this, to trace this relationship. And what we're in fact facing is the possibility, in fact, it's already a reality, of just kind of free-floating books that either are transparently written by AI, like you can find things online, like this was a novel written by AI, that might be fun to read, or attributed to a real author who didn't actually write it. You may have heard of those cases. Or written by an author who wants to take credit for it, but actually they're outsourcing it to AI and then they want to get credit for it. At any rate, what we already have and will surely see more of is this kind of free-floating text where we can't trace the content or the methods or the conclusions to any identifiable human. The originality criterion is doing a lot of work, as I said. And if we were to invite that more free-floating, even postmodern kind of conception of writing without authorship and let AI be the driver of that, notice how many things in our entire academic economy would have to change. Our whole academic economy, and by economy I mean academic credit, like the currency of credit, runs on being able to trace an academic output back to one or more human brains. That is the whole game. So for students, whether they write something or not, what they hand in accounts for their grades. Their grades add up to GPA. Their GPA may determine their scholarships and awards, their future opportunities, whether they get into grad school. This is how we rank and assess students. For scholars, well, we have to get publications. So the academic credit that we're looking for is behind everything that happens in our careers, invitations, promotions, awards, all of it predicated on the ability to trace the academic output back to the scholar who is supposedly behind it. Third section, and as I said, they're getting shorter. Maybe we should just change academic expectations, okay? Maybe that whole system was wrong. There's a lot of other progressive reasons to think that we should ease up on grading, that we should adopt less quantitative metrics of assessing scholarly output. There's lots of good reasons for that. Maybe, just screw all of that. Furthermore, as some people are apparently saying, maybe we just don't need to teach children the reading and writing types of things that we used to. I'm going to try to debunk this claim very quickly before I wrap up. Let's look at the writing process. This is a diagram, one of many that you can find. Obviously, there's no absolute consensus over what all these steps are, but I think it's a pretty good illustration of steps in the writing process, whether you're a student or scholar, beginner, advanced, thinking, developing, etc. Okay? Students are using AI at every stage of this process. Okay, so here's another report by CopyLeaks, but this one is much more recent. This is from just a couple weeks ago. According to the research, students are using AI for summarizing readings. I can attest to this for sure. My students are for sure doing it instead of doing the readings, brainstorming ideas, drafting outlines, generating initial drafts, paraphrasing or rewording, and the final, polish, revising, and editing, all of it. And as I said, you can tell them to stop at this level. This maybe maps on in some ways to some of the charts I showed you earlier, like with, how much AI is allowed. You can tell them, but are they really going to stop? Because in most of these cases, I assume there's already some language saying you're not supposed to use AI for these things. But this is what's happening. So we can only say that it's fine to give up on all of this if we really think that students don't need to learn and practice these skills. what happens when we outsource these kinds of skills? There's growing scientific evidence about the cognitive effects of relying on AI, specifically for writing. This is the famous MIT study that some of you may have come across. It's a very large study, and it was submitted as a pre-publication because they wanted to get the results out. The authors are Kosmina and company, and it's called Your Brain on ChatGPT. I cannot interpret these diagrams for you, but sorry, but I mean, it's still pretty clear even to non-scientists. The upshot is that in this very controlled study with 3 different cohorts, the students who used AI for their writing process had less connectivity between different regions in their brain, less recall of what they had supposedly learned or whether they'd even written it. So when they were given the text back to them, they weren't even necessarily sure which parts they wrote and which parts AI wrote. And then when the AI tool was taken away, they struggled more than the students who never had it in the first place to do the same kind of task again, which you may think is entirely unsurprising, but it's at least been documented, and there continue to be studies that are documenting this scientifically. There are other studies on cognitive offloading in general. Cognitive offloading is outsourcing thinking work to AI or to any other machine. Okay, and these studies, therefore, in some cases predate AI. But what they show is that humans are really lazy. I'm sorry to break it to you. I mean, this applies to all of us because the reason we invent these kinds of devices is to make life easier and more efficient. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with some outsourcing for the sake of efficiency if you know what you're doing. But when it's there and you don't need it or you're not supposed to use it, it's very, very hard not to use it. That's what the studies show. So, for example, this study from 2020 showed that when given the choice, people usually opt to cognitively offload, even for very undemanding tasks where there is no benefit to offloading. How many of you have ever pulled out a calculator to add like 14 and 16 or something like that, which you know you could do in your head, but it would take you a few milliseconds of effort. You don't want to put in the effort, so you whip out the calculator. If we know we're doing it with calculators, you can be sure that we're doing it with like the most powerful computing tool ever invented. There's an even more insidious, I think, psychological effect of getting used to having these devices, which is that if we know that we can use a device to get the answer, in this case, because it was pre-ChatGPT, the author is talking about searching the internet, but we actually convince ourselves that we know the answer. Our brain is not good at distinguishing between knowing something and knowing that we could go find it out if we need to find it out. And that means that when you can just sort of find anything out or just have anything done for you, your brain is very likely to mistake that for being capable of doing it yourself. And here's a study from the current AI era by Fan and company that says AI technology such as ChatGPT may promote learners' dependence on technology and potentially trigger metacognitive laziness. That's a phrase that I think that they coined, but again, there's a lot of studies now showing this kind of effect. Okay, here's a real doozy. Anthropic is the company that made Claude. Okay, it's the AI company. They did their own study. They analyzed over 500,000 conversations with Claude over an 18-day period among university students, all anonymized. And then they used Bloom's taxonomy, which is a sort of ranking of lower order thinking to higher order thinking. You can see on the left there, sideways. And they showed what students were using Claude for. Almost 40% was for the highest level in the ranking of thinking skills, creating. That's what they were using Claude for. And another 30% was for analyzing, which they define as, which Bloom defines as taking apart the known and identify relationships. And this study by Anthropic concludes there are legitimate worries that AI systems may provide a crutch for students, stifling the development of foundational skills needed to support higher order thinking. I find that quite chilling. So what am I saying with all these studies? It's not enough to rejig the assessment economy or our notion of academic credit or really consider dispensing with the originality criterion. There are problems with all those things. They're not perfect. But if we start dispensing with those things, what we're seeing is that just allowing students and scholars to use AI as they will means that they are not doing the thinking and learning and creating at all that we expect them to do. In other words, why have the educational assessment or the scholarship at all? It's not just a question of changing the metrics that we use to decide what counts as good scholarship or good student work. So I'm going to argue in conclusion that originality was more or less tracking the right things. When I say, transparency is the new originality, originality is a bit vague. It's not perfect. I have another talk on that. I'm not suggesting that it's really cut and dried. But when we assumed that work that was submitted for academic assessment was traceable to the person who submitted it, that it came from the activities of their own brain, more or less, and we called that originality, what it ensured was that the educational or scholarly aims of the activity were being respected. And the alternative, when too much of that is outsourced to AI, is that we may feel like we are the ones doing the thinking. But as I just told you, we could be tricking ourselves into thinking that we are knowing or doing things that we're not. And in reality, it's the AI that is generating what we say we're generating. This is an outcome that I don't particularly welcome, not because I think that AI has nothing to contribute to human advancement or enhancing science, but because humans have to have the oversight to decide whether AI is doing what we want it to do or not. We can't relinquish our judgment of what counts as good writing or good scholarship or anything like that to AI. And that means we have to train everybody, students, young people, all of us. We have to keep training in critical thinking and reading and expressing ourselves in natural language. So here are my tentative, perhaps overblown, perhaps underblown conclusions for today. Originality may be messy, but it can't be replaced by transparency. And by replaced, I mean transparency can't be the value that is now guiding our assessment of academic integrity. The best that transparency can do is track the erosion of originality, which is perhaps a very worthwhile thing, but we should not mistake that for it's all okay, use whatever you want to use. We should care about the aims that originality was supposed to protect, which I was just talking about on the last slide. The cognitive activity and the human creativity and discourse between humans that has given rise to educational and scholarly outputs in the past. That is really what we should still care about, even if we have to adjust our metrics. I'm sorry to tell you there are no quick solutions, okay? And if the first question was going to be, so, Dr. Bialystok, what do we do about it? This is like a conceptual paper, okay? I'm ground clearing. I don't have solutions. If I did, I'd probably be very rich. What I'm suggesting is that declarations of AI use may be the best Band-Aid, but we should not forget that they're a Band-Aid. They are not addressing the actual issue. And finally, we really have to guard against normalizing the offloading of academic tasks to AI. We should hopefully be guarding against it with our own work, with any students we're interacting with, and shouting into the wind for anybody who might still be listening, please don't make this the new norm. So I look forward to hearing your questions and thoughts.
So for folks listening online, you can ask questions in the chat and I will say your questions. But for folks who are here, we have this little microphone which you can grab up and ask a question. So who would like to ask a question?
So to make
the mic live, folks, just press the red button, press the button on it and it'll turn red.
Fantastic. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for this talk. I think and I know there's only 2 minutes, so I wrote some notes so that I wouldn't go overboard. If you want to go to the last slide, I find it funny because one of the premises of my work is that I strongly believe that normalizing the offloading of some academic tasks to AI is actually something that we should do in certain contexts. And so you've really challenged some of the belief system that I have. And so I would be curious to know if you believe that there are, in some circumstances, how AI usage could promote learning or benefit students or, promote higher order thinking skills. And so I guess I'm inviting you to challenge your own belief system.
Oh, yeah. Well, I thank you for the question. And yes, I do think, of course, it's a complicated piece of technology. So I wouldn't say it challenges my overall belief system, just that I am sufficiently worried about the risks and harms that I think we have to proceed with more caution than overall people have been proceeding with. I am curious to hear, what kinds of tasks you think it makes sense to normalize offloading to AI, and I'm not necessarily going to say that that's wrong. It's just that the amount of self-awareness and deliberate thinking that you have to do to make those selections is beyond what is being required of most people right now. And that's where I think the critical thinking gets eroded and we get sucked into a kind of lazy offloading without being aware of it. And then, needless to say, AI makes mistakes. And if we can't distinguish, if it's not a human arbiter anymore, then I think we're in trouble. But that said, no, I've come across a lot of educational uses where, for example, certain structured dialogues with AI can really deepen a student's understanding of a topic. I also think it's like wonderfully accessible. So students who may not have access to a teacher who can walk them through different arguments and sort of give them, other ideas to think about would benefit a lot from having an AI tutor of some sort. There's a lot of cases where I think it can promote learning. But I don't see any kind of systematic attempt to limit its use to that kind of learning or to educate people about where to draw the line. I mean, there's sort of banal language in a lot of the policies, like, make sure you're still thinking for yourself. What does that mean? And how do students, especially who are growing up with this technology, know what that means? You have to first teach them to think for themselves or to read text and interpret text themselves. And then only much later, might you be able to meaningfully incorporate AI with a beneficial goal. I think as adults who've gone through our education already, and many of us already being full-time scholars, we have a lot of resources for kind of checking, am I still thinking for myself? Is this particular use of AI beneficial? Or no, actually that text is garbage, that sucks. Or, oh yeah, that turn of phrase is really good. We only know that, I think, because we have decades of experience reading and writing without the opportunity to get a machine to do it for us. I hope that answers your question.
Maybe let's just pass to our expert.
All right, cool. Yeah, I also want to thank you for some of the definitions. So I'm not formally a researcher, I'm more of a part-time instructor, but very interested in this and somewhat very worried about what's happening in my classes. I wanted to ask what your thoughts are on how we've almost systematically failed students on a few other things that I think precede AI. So for example, some people challenge me when I say, AI is messing up the way people approach thinking. They say, oh, but people do this with Google. And I go, you're right. I'm not saying Google was better. People will click the first link, not read it critically, copy and paste out of blog posts. And then I would even say one step back is people are also often really not taught to write so well. We focus so much on the output and not the process.
Yeah.
And we do the same thing with research, like at least not for research, but for students. We focus so much on the citations, but not how they got to them and why they really picked them, unless you're in very certain specific contexts. So I guess I'm wondering, like, how do we address the AI thing if we've struggled so poorly to fix even how we write and then how we research? And this is only the last thing on top.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I don't know how we fix it. But I want to echo a lot of what you said, and then maybe still make a couple distinctions. So certainly, I agree that Google already, can be used very lazily, and if you aren't a good critical researcher, if you don't know how to sort your sources or assess, how reliable a source is and basic things like that, then the internet is also a dangerous place to do research. I absolutely agree that for a long time now, people haven't been learning how to write well enough. And their critical thinking and reasoning is pretty weak too. And I think we can trace quite a lot of the deterioration of public intellectual culture and democracy writ large to failures of standards of education. I'm not blaming teachers or educators, just that it's kind of proof of why we need robust education where everybody has some basic skills and the ability and the willingness to dialogue together. So it's a huge problem. That said, I think that AI is different in kind as well as just another degree of this. And maybe the best way to explain that is with the calculator. Imagine a society where like nobody learned math because they only learned what they needed to know to put it into a calculator, right? I think that would be bad, right? I think that people need to have number sense, need to master some basics of mathematics, even if they're not going to go into math. And ChatGPT, you could say, is sort of like that, but for so many other areas as well, including writing. Why is that different or worse? Well, one reason is the calculator won't give you a wrong answer. The authority that the calculator suggests by being computerized and having a screen display and all of that is legitimate authority. It's going to give you the right answer. ChatGPT and other AI sounds authoritative and speaks to us in ways that we are evolutionarily, I think, designed to take as authoritative. And certainly those of us who grew up with computers, like, sounds authoritative, but it's not authoritative. It can hallucinate, but also it's just one of many possible answers. So Google has problems, and I'm really upset at how Google has evolved to give each person like a tailored result to their searches. That's a real problem that, again, breaks down the fabric of sharing information that's the basis of democracy and all of that stuff. And at the very least, the websites are the same no matter what. You might get them in one order and I get them in a different order, but if we go to the website, it's the same website. If you ask ChatGPT the same question you put into Google, and I ask ChatGPT, we're going to get different things. And there's no way of knowing, it's not public. And I think that breakdown and that lack of accountability and the way it hacks our credulity in the authority of certain pronouncements is just a very toxic combination that's unlike the other ones you mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah, what's your take on AI generated peer review?
Oh. I think you can probably guess. Look, I haven't done it. And to my knowledge, I haven't been the recipient of it. So I'm sorry. So AI generated peer review, I think, is obviously unethical if it's a substitute for actual human peer review. I can imagine that, as in many other applications, if you already have a sense of what you think, or if you've already written something and you want to sort of test it out, AI might give you more to think about, or might put your criticisms in more diplomatic language, which could be a good thing perhaps. But to outsource the actual critique of the paper to AI, I just think it's unethical. And I think that the irony that we could have AI written papers being submitted to journals, assessed by AI peer review, and that this entire like simulacrum of the actual scholarly process, I think is a little bit like 10% amusing and 90% horrifying.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, but also that implies that whatever's being reviewed was shared with an AI.
Oh,
Legit?
no, sure. I hadn't, you know, you're right. No, I mean, that's, unless it's some kind of incredibly closed AI system that's not using the data to train or remember anything. No, you're right. That's also completely unethical.
I mean, in a lot, even in the like the student academic work, there could be a lot of that sort of stuff going
Yes.
on. And
Yes.
that sort of goes under the radar. We're all thinking about like the originality thing, but
No, you're right. I mean, a whole dimension of the ethics or lack of ethics of AI that I didn't even mention is, you know, the stolen intellectual property on which AI is predicated and on which it continues to grow. And that's partly related to originality, I mean, because of the, you know, academic credit. But it also goes way beyond that when your work is being made public or sent out into the universe before you've given permission for that to happen.
So we have another question here from online. It's from Rasheen, who asks, she says, quote, my understanding of Sarah Eaton's work is that she is suggesting a shift from a focus on plagiarism to a focus on promoting academic integrity, and by that I would include the responsible use of AI. And it seems that the academic assessment scale from Perkins et al., which was shown, is attempting to encourage teachers to think about how they can promote the responsible use of AI. I'm wondering if you would see a place for this, I guess this approach that we, you know, see from Eaton and Perkins et al., or if you see another approach entirely.
Thank you for the question. So I've gone back to Eaton's diagram here. Perhaps I misunderstood the first part of the question, but what I would say is that you can't focus on academic integrity and not have a conception of plagiarism. Plagiarism is the absence of academic integrity or vice versa. I mean, they're two sides of the same coin. So I think that if she means by post-plagiarism, we don't need a concept of plagiarism anymore, maybe we just need something else, then it can't be academic integrity because there has to be something that fails to meet that bar in order to discuss academic integrity. I do, yes, appreciate that both Eaton and Perkins, not Miller. This person doesn't mean Miller.
No, they meant this one, yeah. No, that one.
Oh, that one. Okay. Thank you. I do think that they're contributing to an absolutely vital conversation, and that, as I said, breaking down different elements of academic integrity or plagiarism, looking at the components of writing and the skills that students are supposed to be learning through different assignments is very important. What I'm skeptical about is this confidence that we will get to a place where we can seamlessly incorporate AI writing and still distribute academic credit in principled ways on the basis of how much people have learned and produced themselves. I think that that distinction is in very grave danger. I wish I don't have a better diagram, so I fully take the point. You know, these kinds of things are evocative and thoughtful, and it's a good starting point. And I don't have a diagram I'm going to show you that says this is what we should do with academic integrity or plagiarism. But what I've tried to argue is that originality has to remain one of the linchpins between the kind of work that we accept and the kind of work that we don't accept, as well as all the variations in ranking of acceptable work. It still has to be in there. And to me, post-plagiarism sounds like it's content to depart from that.
Who else would like to ask a question?
Thank you, Lauren. One question. How do we convince students/humans of the value of effortful thinking?
It's a great question. No, I think it's you know, that's the $1,000,000 question in many ways. I mean, all I can do is say a little bit about what I've been doing as an instructor, but I'm not purporting to have answers or even suggest that these things are transferable. So I have the luxury of teaching all graduate students. So they're already probably more motivated to be there and do the learning than undergrad or other compulsory education students. Although I would say not entirely, because there's also a lot of grad students who are getting professional degrees, and it's kind of a credentialing situation. What I try to do is start by talking to them about the risks of AI, the cognitive risks that they're running, and ask them to reflect on why they're at a university doing what they're doing. Um, and I try to make the material as exciting as I can for them and do a lot of the work that I expect them to be doing on their own, and that, conventional assessments we're tracking together in the class. So like, let's read this paragraph together. And I teach philosophy, so that like it's often quite dense. And I say, let's read this paragraph together and talk about what it means and connect it to other things that we've read. And imagine that you just read a summary of this text and you didn't read that paragraph, because AI is always pushing summaries on you. Have you noticed this? Like, you just open something up and poof, a box comes up and says, this looks like a long document. Would you like a summary? And I point this out to my students and I say, like, as if no one wants to read. AI is assuming that we're all way too busy with other things to read, but aren't we in graduate school to read? So I try to do it with them and ask them, what might be lost if they're taking shortcuts. And I also have a small enough number of students that I can get to know their writing and speaking style individually, which gives me at least a pretty good baseline to figure out if they've gone too far. Again, I'm not saying that's enough or that it's transferable, just a few starting places.
So from online here, we have Julia, who says there's a new study. She just writes this as a comment that shows that AI HR assistants prefer AI written cover letters over human written cover letters. Okay, so that's great. I thought that was a wonderful addition to our discussion. And Richard asks, what should teachers in the K-12 context know about and do in their classrooms in response to your core points?
Thanks for that question. I am not close enough to K-12 classrooms, as a researcher to speak with much authority. I'm a parent, and sometimes that kind of gives me enough to know what to be worried about. But what I would say is, in elementary school, I don't see any need for these tools at all. And I can only imagine that introducing them in elementary school or junior school would interfere with the exact cognitive skills and habits of mind that we have to cultivate. And no, like, we didn't do a good enough job before, but that's not a reason to give up. We have to double down. In secondary school, and depending on how well we've cultivated those habits of mind in primary school, I can imagine situations where, it's only realistic, even if in a resigned way, it's realistic to say, okay, this is the world you live in. Like, let's use these tools in some cases. You'll still immediately run into the problems I pointed to, which is that you can't, whatever your line is, you can't reliably enforce it. So I'm sorry to the high school teachers as well. It's a nightmare to try to have standards that you can't enforce and then not even be able to confront students when you think that they've not abided by the standards because you can't find the website that they copied from anymore. So it's still overly simplistic, but I would say briefly, based on the little bit that I know about what's happening in schools, my sense is there is no place for it until at the earliest junior high school, and then it should be very controlled. And there are some things that schools can do and are starting to do to just take technology out of classrooms. And maybe you lose some of the other benefits of technology, but so be it. Like, maybe we need some more paper and pen classrooms.
Who else would like to ask a question? Okay.
Thank you. I struggled a little bit to articulate what I was trying to ask, so I hope that this makes sense. But I was thinking about what you said about authorship, and I think that authorship is contextual. For example, if you're thinking about it in terms of intellectual property, it's going to be maybe different than if you're thinking about it in terms of, like, for the purposes of assessment. And I think that maybe academic integrity is contextual in the same way. And I feel like maybe part of the problem with relying too heavily on transparency is that it attempts to create like a blanket policy for all contexts.
Yeah.
So maybe part of the problem is that there isn't going to be like a universally applicable standard or a set of guidelines. So I'm wondering just what do you think about that, and like where is there space for like broad guidelines, and where do we maybe need more specific ones?
Thank you. No, that made perfect sense. And I think it's a really good question. So I have for a couple years already been criticizing my institutions and most institutions response non-response to AI in terms of what they've told instructors. Mostly what they've said is make up your mind, tell your students what your expectations are, and then do that. And that is not very helpful. And also the institution is very concerned about liability. So they have perhaps different priorities in mind. Nonetheless, what that extremely vague policy accomplishes is it recognizes that context matters. And depending on the discipline, the professor, the year of the students, et cetera, different policies will be appropriate. It would be an absolute mistake to suggest that there's one policy, perhaps even transparency, that should apply across the board, okay? So you need some balance between universal and specific. And I agree that transparency policies might, in fact, be applied too generally. I have to think about that more. I don't know. I think your question about authorship is also really relevant. Certainly, I was moving between scholars and students, and they're not the same groups. One of the things that Foucault says in this essay is that authorship has mattered more and less at different times and for different purposes. If anyone who's read Foucault knows sort of this is his like big aha move that he always does. Like, well, historically, did you know that, there was a case in France in 1620 where, they found a document and they didn't know who. But of course, but it makes sense in the sense that like a legal document isn't usually tethered to an author the way that fiction is. And different, letters are a very different kind of authorship than something that's published, right? So we can't have one standard for everything. And the standards that we have now are also the product of different moments in modern Western civilization. So that said, I think to go back to my academic credit economy point here, like I think we shouldn't use blanket standards for all these different purposes either. And already, between disciplines, a lot of these things vary. Like who's first author? How many authors are there? Do you get a footnote acknowledgement or are you 16th author? Like all of that varies depending on the discipline. And what's important is just that people know the conventions. What's important is that people know what is and isn't signified by authorship. So, in medical research, they understand it one way, and in philosophy research, we understand it a different way. But there has to be an economy of credit that makes sense for that domain. And if we don't have any notion of authorship, or if we let AI sort of creep in however much the humans feel like it should, and then just sign the transparency form, I think that we're not upholding enough of a standard with which to distribute these very consequential outcomes. If it weren't so consequential, what GPA students graduated with, or how many publications a professor had when they go up for tenure, okay, fine, maybe we could care a little less. But these things matter like a huge amount. So overall, yes, I take your point, and I want to think more about how universal transparency could be.
Well, folks, I think we've come to the end of our time. I do like to end these things on time, so you can talk to Lauren after the session, I'm sure. Let's have a round of applause for Lauren.